Hey, what's up? My name is Wes. Welcome to this third official lesson of this online Spanish course. In today's lesson, we are going to look at the alphabet. And as you can see, this lesson is purple. So anytime we have a purple lesson, we will discuss grammar. Anytime we have a blue lesson, we will talk about vocabulary. Anytime we have a green lesson, we will talk about the basics or the fundamentals. And we will also have yellow lessons, which we will get to in a later lesson, which are the verbs, which is also part of grammar. Anyways, that's not very important for now. For today, we are going to go over the alphabet. And the reason why I think it's important to go over the alphabet is because I think it's important for you to understand how to pronounce the letters in Spanish. Now, even if you already know some Spanish and you've been practicing and you probably already know the alphabet, I still recommend to go over this lesson because first of all, it never hurts to learn something that you already know again because it stimulates those neural pathways in your brain. And also because pronunciation is such an important part of the language, so the more you practice it, the better. Alright, so the first letter of the alphabet is the A. And in English we say A. In Spanish we say A.
A. A.
So with each letter, I will also give you an example. So for the letter A, we will look at azul, which means blue.
Azul. Azul.
So we don't say A, but we say A. So azul, not azul, azul. And the letter Z here is also pronounced a bit differently than you might expect. So again, azul. Try to repeat these words out loud to practice for yourself also.
Azul.
Alright, so the next letter is
B. B.
So an example would be
Bebé. Bebé.
and the last E here has an accent. And we use this to indicate that that's where we put the stress. So we don't say bibe, we say bebe.
Bebé.
Alright, then we have the C.
C. C.
Now, in Spanish, there's two ways to pronounce the C. There's more of a hard C, and there is more of a soft C. If the C is at the beginning of the word, then we use more of a hard C, which is more of a K almost. So in this case, class, we say clase.
Clase. Clase.
And then another example of a C that appears in the middle of a word would be with this example.
Canción. Canción.
So we have the hard C at the beginning, but then we have the other C in the middle. So
Canción.
and this C is very important in the Spanish language, and it's also pretty difficult for us foreigners to pronounce this C perfectly. Again, I'm not a native speaker, so I'm also not perfect at this, but in general, what you want to do is bite your tongue, or not literally bite your tongue, but act like you're biting your tongue and then let the air slip through, which is the th.
Canción.
Right, let's move on to the D, which is
D. D.
for example, in dia.
Día. Día.
Alright, so then we get to the E, and E is a very important letter because in Spanish we don't say E, we say E.
E. E.
So in English we say elephant. And what a lot of foreigners do when they speak in Spanish is they will pronounce this word here as elefante, but it's elefante.
Elefante. Elefante.
So soft E. Alright, then the F, which is F in Spanish.
F. F.
So the example word that we have here is
Fruta. Fruta.
which means fruit. Now, you will actually see that a lot of Spanish words are quite similar to English, but that they are written just a bit different or have a slightly different pronunciation. And this is actually very helpful because if you think about it, Spanish is actually not that hard of a language to learn. It's not like Mandarin or Arabic, for example. What you will see very often is that Spanish words look a lot like British words. And we will get to this in a later lesson also. But it makes sense if you think about it because Spanish and English actually originate from Latin and Roman times. And so in a way it has the same roots. But over the years the pronunciation and the ways of saying things just different a bit. Alright, let's move on to the next letter, which is the G.
G. G.
However, one thing to notice is that the sound of the letter G depends on the vowel that follows the letter G. So if the G is followed by an A, such as in gato, then it has more of this G sound.
Gato. Gato.
If the G is followed by an I, then the sound is way harder. So we say
Girasol. Girasol.
So there's two different ways of saying the G. So one is more soft.
Gato.
And one is more hard or strong, which is
Girasol.
Alright, let's move on to the next letter, which is the letter H. Now, the H, as we learned in the first lesson, is always soft in Spanish, so we don't really pronounce it. However, if you want to spell something, you want to say, for example, my name is Wes. Well, actually, Wes is not a good example because there is no H in there, but if you want to spell the letter and it has the H in it, you say H. So the H is H in Spanish.
H. H.
So if you're looking at an example, then man, for example, is hombre. So we kind of act like the H doesn't exist. However, if we write in Spanish, then it's very important to write the letter H. So when you speak in Spanish, you just act like the H does not exist. But then when you write it, you do need to act as if it exists, and you do need to write it. Alright, so then the I in Spanish, which is
I. I.
So for example,
Intuición. Intuición.
And here again we see this C that we just learned. So intuition.
Intuición.
Alright, then the J, which is actually called J in Spanish.
J. J.
Now the J is not pronounced the same as in English. Usually it's more harsh, like ejemplo or jamón. So it's more like a G sound almost. So for example, let's take the word exercise.
Ejercicio. Ejercicio.
Again, this is one of these examples where the English word is very similar to the Spanish word.
Ejercicio.
Alright, so then the letter K, and in Spanish the letter K is
K. K.
So as an example, the word kilogram in Spanish is
Kilogramo. Kilogramo.
Alright, so then the letter L, which is L.
L. L.
So for example,
Leche. Leche.
or what we learned in one of the previous lessons also is that if we have a double L, the L sound changes into a Y sound. So not calle, but calle with a double L.
Calle. Calle.
Alright, then the next one is M, the letter M, which is M.
M. M.
So for example, the word máquina, which means machine in English.
Máquina. Máquina.
And you notice that I don't say máquina here because the accent is on the A. So that's why we want to stress the accent. So máquina instead of máquina. More about the accents in a later lesson. For now, this is just something to be aware of. And then the next letter is also an important one to pay attention to, which is the N.
N. N.
Not the N, which we just learned, but N. So for example, naranja.
Naranja. Naranja.
And again, notice the J here, which turns into a harsh, almost G sound.
Naranja.
And then we have the next letter, which is the N, but then with this weird accent on top, which is the ñ.
Ñ. Ñ.
And this is actually the only letter that is different in the Spanish alphabet than in the English alphabet. The rest of the Spanish and English alphabet are all the same. So the ñ, as in niños, niños, which means children.
Niños. Niños.
Or año, which is a year. So we don't say ano, we say año.
Año. Año.
this N with the weird accent on top is very important, and so you will see it a lot in the Spanish language. Alright, then the next letter is O.
O. O.
For example, in the word office, which in Spanish is
Oficina. Oficina.
or
Ojo. Ojo.
again, beautiful example of the O and the J. The J turns into this rough G sound and the O on both sides. Just a beautiful example.
Ojo.
Alright, then the letter P in Spanish, which is pronounced as
P. P.
as in.
Playa. Playa.
Alright, then the Q is
Q. Q.
so an example is
¿Quién? ¿Quién?
which means who in Spanish. This is a very common word that you will see also. Again, for now, I don't want you to learn the words that we will go over. You don't need to put these on flashcards or whatever. These are just example words that I want to show you to explain how to pronounce these letters. So don't worry about learning these. You don't have to. Alright, and then the R. And this is a very difficult one, especially for us non-native speakers, because you pronounce this by rolling your tongue up and down. So it sounds like this.
R. R.
So as an example, we have the word watch, which in Spanish is
Reloj. Reloj.
or.
Perro. Perro.
Alright, so let's move on to the next letter, which is the S, which is.
S. S.
So for example, in the word.
Sueño. Sueño.
And again, we have this ñ in here, so not sueño, but sueño, which means dream. And then we have the T, which is.
T. T. Tiempo. Tiempo.
And then the next letter is the U, which is U.
U. U. Universidad. Universidad.
And then the V, which is V.
V. V.
And we usually just pronounce this as a V. So, for example.
Viajar. Viajar.
Alright, W, my favorite letter of the alphabet because it's the first letter of my name. And the W in Spanish is actually called double V. So we say V doble.
W. W.
And what's interesting about this letter is that originally it was not actually used in the Spanish alphabet, but only later it was taken over into the Spanish alphabet. And the reason why that's actually pretty interesting is that anytime you see a word that has the letter W at the beginning, such as Halloween, it is usually a foreign word, so a word that comes from another language and that made its way into the Spanish language. So Halloween, for example, is an English word. Or an example of another word that is not originally Spanish is Wi-Fi, which in Spanish is called
Wi-Fi. Wi-Fi.
Alright, so then the next letter is the letter X, and in Spanish we say
X. X.
and the X also sometimes sounds a bit like the C that we learned before. So for example, connection.
Conexión. Conexión.
And what I also think is important for you to notice here is that in English we see two N's next to each other, which the N is a consonant. That's the grammatical term of how to describe the N. So an N is a consonant, and the O and the E and the I are vowels. So consonants such as the C and the N. Usually what we do in English is we connect two N's next to each other to make the reader understand that the O is a soft O. Because if there would only be one N, then you would say connection. But because there's two N's next to each other, we understand that it is actually connection and not connection. In Spanish, these double consonants are actually almost never really used. And that is because every vowel in Spanish, such as the E or the I or the O, actually only has one sound. And in one of the next lessons, I will actually explain this in a bit more detail. But for now, I just want you to notice that in English, often you will see words written with double letters, so double consonants. And in Spanish, you don't really see this happening. The only time you will see this happening is when we use a word that is not originally Spanish, such as Halloween. Alright, so then the next letter is the letter Y, which in Spanish is
Y. Y.
So an example would be yogurt, which in Spanish is
Yogur. Yogur.
Alright, and then we have come to the last letter, which is the letter Z. And Z in Spanish is
Zeta. Zeta.
So for example,
Zapatillas. Zapatillas.
again, we have this double L here, which turns into a Y sound. So not zapatillas, but zapatillas. Alright, and that is it for this third lesson. I know that this lesson was maybe not as exciting as the other lessons that we went over, but it is actually important to go over the alphabet because it's one of the fundamentals of the language. Now, as always, what's good for you to know is that there is a reference sheet of today's lesson that you can find on my website. I will leave a link in the description which takes you to a download page where you can download the reference sheet for today's lesson. And what I recommend you to do also is, if you're still not sure exactly how to pronounce certain letters, then to maybe watch a few more videos and really practice your pronunciation before you move on. Alright, that's it for this video. Thank you so much for watching. I hope that this was helpful to you. For now, there's a couple of things that we can say. We can say adios, hasta luego, hasta mañana, or hasta la próxima, which I think we haven't learned yet. Or we can say arrivederci. No, I'm just kidding. That's Italian. But hope to see you in the next one. Alright, take care. Adios.